Jane's race. The love of God is likened unto a mother watching her daughter's race. This was the morning that Jane would run her duathlon. It was as warm as could be expected in England, and the air held a beautiful fragrance of promise. All summer she had been bubbling with excitement about completing the race. Now was the moment to relish. Although she knew she wasn't the fastest runner, she felt good about her cycling ability. It was something she wanted to do, and she was determined to enjoy it. Going with her mother to sign up had made her a little nervous. Pinning the bold number 21 on her back made it very official. Decided. There was no turning back now. Also, it was the first opportunity to meet her competition. There were taller, leaner children or those with more developed muscles. They had sparkly new bikes in racing red, electric blue, or winning gold. Most of them were older than her, benefiting from more practice and probably having planned a better strategy. Some of them were even confident enough to come without their parents, happy to ask a stranger to help them pin on their number. Suddenly, Jane felt very out of place and completely overwhelmed. By the time everyone was instructed to gather at the starting line, Jane was reluctant to join them. There were just so many spectators. The grass track was surrounded by hordes of parents and friends, every eye on the participants. Jane was scared of what they would all think of her, frightened of their laughter if she fell behind. The course, which had seemed so exciting when other people were competing, was suddenly a horrible place where she would be separated from her family. Gathering the children close, the announcer described the course. The first section was a short run around half of the track before they picked up their bikes. This seemed an easy way to get the children used to the race. Then there was the more dangerous changing station, where it was more than likely people would crash into one another. This could easily result in them toppling over like dominoes as they tried to get used to their bikes, while several of them had barely been off training wheels. That was one of the make or break moments, where the choice about steering and speed were vitally important. This would probably determine their positions for the majority of the cycling, unless they were particularly skilled at overtaking on narrow paths. They were then expected to ride around the outside of the arena, hidden from most of the crowd by a row of trees. This was a disappointingly short stretch, not even half the length of all the running. Jane chewed her lip at the news. Finally, there was another run, which went far out from the main track. They would be completely alone for most of this, until they arrived back in the circle under the eyes of the crowd. It was what it was. There was no changing it, and there was no way to avoid the obstacles that were bound to appear. Jane lined up with the others, content with the second row rather than jostling her way into the front. She tried to prepare herself, breathe naturally, grip the earth with her flimsy trainers, and hold her hands flat like she had been taught. However, none of it mattered, because when the starting gun fired, there was only blind panic. Most of the children set off at a terrific pace. Jane could almost see the dust clouds they kicked up. For a moment she thought of copying them, but she knew she could only maintain a slower stride. During the first run she hovered at the back of the group, steadily overtaking those that had overestimated their sprinting ability. Although some of the young boys were furious to slip behind her, short bursts were unsustainable. By the time she reached her bike, she had a reasonable position. Her mother was waiting with her bike upright, ready for Jane to hop on. They managed to switch well, and Jane was soon pedalling out of the changing station. She noticed that several of the other children had been pushed along by their parents at quite a distance, whereas Jane had been immediately deserted. While she thought it unfair of her mother not to give as much help as possible, she didn't let the worry interfere with her riding. Feet spinning, Jane managed to sneak up a couple of places. She kept riding to the very edge of the second changing station, dropping her bike without a thought. After being on the bike, her legs felt wobbly, making the run even more difficult. Whilst this affected all of the competitors, Jane seemed to suffer more. She just kept going, even though people were already rushing past her. As the group ran further away from the original track, Jane began to feel increasingly tired. She couldn't help but feel disappointed by the number of people overtaking her. With tears starting to cloud her vision, she stumbled along the grass. As Jane stepped onto the uneven surface of the path that led back to the track, her knee buckled and she fell among the hard stones. She had fallen awkwardly, one leg folded beneath her, and the knee had a massive gouge out of it. As the last two people behind her came puffing past, Jane discovered blood coming from the wound. Already weakened, she doubted whether she even had strength to stand up again. It was pointless. The time she'd spent on the floor, added to the hobble she would endure to finish, meant that she'd be embarrassingly slow. They might even have begun the race of the older children before she made it back. The hopelessness of the situation caused tears to mingle with the blood on her hands. To Jane, it felt like forever, but soon her mother was at her side, encouraging her to get up. This only made Jane cry harder and protest that it was too much to expect of her. She just wished that her mother would scoop her up in her arms and carry her to wherever the rest of the family were. No one else's parent would have been so anxious to force their child through more pain. Jane really felt like the unluckiest girl in the world. Her mother did not lift her up, she did not stop urging her to finish the race, and she did not go away. Instead, she kept expressing how disappointed Jane would be with herself if she did not complete the course. Jane could not agree with this. The nominal crossing of the line seemed thoroughly pointless from this position. It would only involve a lot of effort and even more embarrassment. She pleaded for her mother to hoist her onto her shoulders and cross the line together. She was told that this would not be fair on the other participants and that she would not get the same warm feeling inside. It was agony. Every step Jane took, she thought her left leg would buckle again because her bleeding knee hurt so much. Would the wound ever heal? Perhaps her soft skin might be marred by an ugly scar, which made Jane feel even more like giving up. She was upset that her mother did not seem to be taking the situation seriously enough. So she cried as she hobbled along. This did nothing to outwardly increase her mother's sympathy. She simply walked alongside her daughter, ceaselessly encouraging her to endure to the end. The path opened up into the main track. Jane could see the finish line, but the course swerved around the long semicircle of the track. She wanted to take the shortcut, but one look from her mother removed any possibility of that. Still feeling unbelievably hard done by, Jane started to walk more normally, even attempting a loping jog as some of the spectators caught sight of her. With her mother still at her side, Jane continued to the growing sound of applause. She had never seen so many smiling faces, and they were all directed at her. There were complete strangers clapping their hands together and urging her to take those final steps across the line. She spotted her father and brother near the end, eager for her to join them on the other side of the line. They were waving their hands, furiously beckoning at her on. Although they were unable to physically help her, she finally felt the emotional support she had needed the most. Jane couldn't quite remember how she had crossed the line. Her mother said that she collapsed into the grass on the other side. She had memories of a golden medal with triumphant runners engraved on it being thrust into her hands. There was a blur of people grinning at her, helping her stand, walking with her to join the lucky spectators. Ice cream materialized with a chunky flake wedged in the delicious cone. As she sat down and smiled, she rubbed her fingers against the runners on the medal and fingered the striped ribbon. For the rest of the day, people congratulated her, recognizing her above any other participants. It didn't matter that she'd been the last to cross the line. Everyone was just proud that she had finished at all. The winners had run a good race, but with the help of a persistent mother, Jane had overcome the most.